and we'll put a semicolon at the end since we're saving in a variable. So this variable now contains a function. We're using the exact same syntax as before, except we're just taking this function and saving it in a variable because functions are values. So now that this function is inside this variable, let's actually console.log it. So we'll console.log function 1 and save. And this will show us that the variable function 1 actually contains this function. Now on a new line, we can also do console.log and check the type of function 1 and save. And it will tell us that the type of this variable is a function. So as you can see, a function is just another type of value, and we can save it in a variable. We can also run the function inside this variable by typing the variable name function 1, and because this contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. So this will run the code inside this function. If we save, it displays hello 2. Now let's do some cleanup in this code. In JavaScript, as long as there's a way to access a function, this function name is not needed. So here, we can access this function using this variable. So this function name is not needed, and we can actually just delete it, like this. And now this is called an anonymous function, which means a function without a name. Now, an interesting thing to know is that the function syntax that we've been using this entire course up here is actually a shortcut for this code. Now, even though this syntax uses var, and we usually don't recommend var, this syntax actually has a couple advantages. Number one, it's easier to read, and number two, it gives us a feature called hoisting, which means we can call this function greeting brackets before we create it in the code. So using hoisting, we don't have to worry about what order we write this code. Hoisting doesn't work when we create our function and save it in a variable like this. So in JavaScript, functions are values, and just like any other value, we can save it in a variable. Now let's think, what else can we do with a value? Well, we can save a value in an object. For example, let's scroll down and create some new lines, and we'll create an object. Const object 1 equals curly brackets. And inside this object, we'll have a property num with the value 2. So this saves the number 2 inside this object. Now, because functions are values, we can also save a function inside this object. So we'll type comma, and then a property fun, colon, and we'll create a function this time. Function, greeting, brackets, and curly brackets, and inside we'll type console.log the string hello 3. So this saves a function inside this object under the property fun. Now to access this function, we just use the dot notation as normal. So object 1 dot fun. And because this value is a function, we can call it using brackets. If we save, this will run the code inside the function and display hello 3. So remember, this is called a method when we have a function saved inside an object. Again, as long as there's a way to access this function, for example, using object1.fun, then we don't need this function name. So we'll delete it and use an anonymous function. Now let's think. What else can we do with a value? We can pass a value into a function. For example, down here, let's create a function display brackets and curly brackets, and we'll give this function a parameter. So in here, we'll create a parameter and name it param. And inside the function, we can use a parameter just like a variable. So we'll console.log the param. And then down here, let's call this function using display brackets and 2. This will take the value 2, save it inside param, and then we can use it just like a variable. If we save, this will display 2 in the console. So this is known as passing a value into a function. Now, because functions are values, we can also pass a function into a function. So let's give it a try. Down here, we'll create a new function run brackets and curly brackets. And this function will also have a parameter. Let's call it param. And down here, we'll call this function run brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it a function this time. So we'll type function brackets and curly brackets. And inside the function, we'll type console.log the string hello 4. So this will take this function and save it inside param. And now up here, we can use param just like a variable. So we can type param, and because param contains a function, we can actually just call it using brackets. If we save, this code will run the function that we created down here and display hello 4. So this is called passing a function into another function. The function that we're passing in is called a callback function or a callback. So to summarize, functions are values. Anything we can do with a value, we can also do with a function. Now let's do some practical examples using functions as values. We're going to learn a feature of JavaScript called setTimeout. SetTimeout allows us to run a function in the future. First, we'll comment out the previous code using /* and at the bottom, */. And let's create some new lines. And we're going to type the code set capital T time out. So setTimeout is a built-in function. So we can type brackets to call this function. Now setTimeout takes 2 parameters. Inside these brackets, the first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. Let's create a function, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside this function, let's type console.log the string time out. So here we're using a function as a value and we're passing it into another function. At the end, we'll type a comma and we'll give setTimeout a second parameter. The second parameter is how long to wait before running this function. So this is a number in milliseconds. 1000 milliseconds is equal to 1 second. So if we type 3000 milliseconds, this is equal to 3 seconds. So setTimeout will wait for 3 seconds and then call this function. If we save, after 3 seconds, it's going to display timeout in the console. So that's setTimeout. We give it a function and it will call this function after a certain amount of time. So now we're going to learn an important concept called asynchronous code. So after set timeout, let's type console.log the string next line and save. So notice that it displays next line first, and then after 3 seconds, it displays timeout. So what's happening here? Why are they reversed? Set timeout sets up a timer, and after 3 seconds, it will call this function. However, it doesn't actually wait for the 3 seconds to finish. It just sets up the timer and immediately goes to the next line. So that's why this line is displayed first. So this is called asynchronous code. Asynchronous code means the computer won't wait for this line to finish before going on to the next line. So for set timeout, it'll just set up the timer and then immediately go to the next line. Synchronous code, on the other hand, means the computer will wait for one line to finish before going to the next line. So all the code we've written in this course so far has been synchronous code. In addition, all the code inside this function is also synchronous code. So if we added console.log the string timeout2 and save, the code inside the function will still run line by line. It will wait for each line to finish before going to the next line. And after 3 seconds, it will display timeout followed by timeout2. So don't worry, all the code that we normally write will be synchronous code. It will run line by line as usual. The only time that code becomes asynchronous is when we use certain features of JavaScript, like set timeout. So set timeout is the only part that is asynchronous. Now, the advantage of set timeout being asynchronous is that it doesn't block our code for 3 seconds, waiting for this timer to finish. It just sets up the timer in the background and then goes to the next line of code. So this allows our code to do other things while this timer is running in the background. And this is similar to real life. If you set up a timer on your alarm clock, you're not going to stop and wait for the timer to finish. You're going to go and do something else. Asynchronous code is the exact same concept. Next, we're going to learn a similar function to set timeout called set interval. So at the bottom, let's type the code set capital I interval. And set interval is another built-in function, so we can call it using brackets. And set interval takes the same 2 parameters as set timeout. The first parameter is a function that we want to run in the future. So let's type function, brackets, and curly brackets, and inside we'll type console.log the string interval. Now let's add a comma, and the second parameter is also a number in milliseconds. So we'll type 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. So set interval will run this function 3 seconds in the future, but this time it will keep running the function every 3 seconds. If we save in the console, every 3 seconds it will run the function and display interval. So set interval is also asynchronous. Below it, if we type console.log the string next line 2 and save, it will set up the interval and then immediately go to the next line and display next line 2. So that's set interval. We give it a function and it will keep running this function after a certain period of time. So now let's do a project using what we learned so far. Let's go to our browser and we'll create a new tab at the top. And here, let's type supersimple.dev/project projects/advanced-functions and press enter. So this is basically the rock, paper, scissors game that we created earlier, except this time it has an extra button called auto play. If we click this button, every second the computer will play by itself. So this feature will help us practice using set interval. So first, let's make a copy of the project files. We'll go into our code editor and click this icon to show our files. And let's make a copy of 10 rock, paper, scissors for this lesson. So we'll right click, copy, and down here, right click and paste. And I'll stop this for now. So here, we're going to change the name by right clicking, rename. We'll remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, we'll change it to 12 and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the JavaScript and CSS files. So we'll click this file and right click, copy, and then click the folder, right click, paste, and we'll rename this file. Right click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12 and press enter. And let's also make a copy of the CSS file. Select it, right click, copy, click the folder, right click and paste. And right click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12 and press enter. Now let's scroll down to 12 rock, paper, scissors. And I'll close this for now. And inside the head, let's change this to load 12 rock, paper, scissors. And we'll scroll to the bottom. And here, instead of the lesson 10 file, we'll load the lesson 12 JavaScript file. Let's save. And we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. So now we're ready to begin. Let's go back to supersimple.dev. And the first thing we're going to create is this auto play button. So beside the reset score button, which is here, we're going to create a new button, less than, button, greater than, and inside we'll have the text auto play. Let's save and go back to our tab. And now we have this button. So next, let's style this button with CSS. So we'll give it a class equals auto-play-button, and save. And now let's open the CSS file. I'm going to take this file and then drag it to the bottom so I can see it side by side. So I'll close this for now and rearrange this a little bit. And then down here, and we're going to style the auto play button. So let's just make the style the same as the reset score button. So in the CSS, we'll scroll down to the reset score button styles. So we'll add a comma at the end and type dot auto dash play dash button. So now these styles will apply to the class reset score button and the auto play button. If we save, now we styled our project. So next, let's make this button interactive. So at the top here, we'll add an on-click attribute. And then in here, we're going to run some JavaScript code. Let's actually create a function so we can separate the JavaScript into its own file. So we'll run a function called auto play and brackets. So now let's save. And right now, this function doesn't exist. So we have to create this function in the JavaScript file. So for me, the file is right here. I'll select it and then drag it down here so I can see it side by side. So let's scroll down, and I'm going to create it just above the play game function. So here, we'll create some new lines and type function auto play, brackets and curly brackets. And now inside this function, we want to play the game every second. So we can use set interval to run some code every second. So let's type set interval brackets, and inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run. So brackets and curly brackets. And then at the end, let's type a comma, and we'll give it 1000. So this means it will run this function every 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second. And now inside this function, we're going to automatically play the game. And to play the game, we can use this function right here, play game. So here, we'll type play game brackets. Now we need to provide this function with a player move. And remember, we have another function, pick computer move, which will give us a random move. So above this line, let's create a variable const player move, and we'll make it equal, and we'll pick a random move using pick computer move and brackets. And finally, we'll take this move that we picked and pass it in to this function. So player move. So now when we click this button, it should play the game every second. Let's save and click autoplay, and it works. The computer is playing against itself every second. So now let's make this button stop playing when we click it again. So at the top, let's create a variable to keep track of whether or not we're playing. So we use let is auto playing, and at the start, we'll make it equal to false and save. And now inside this function, we'll check using an if statement, brackets and curly brackets. And inside this condition, let's check if we're not playing. So not is auto playing. So if we're not playing, then we want to start playing the game, which is this code down here. So let's select this code and then right click, cut, and in here, right click and paste. And also, after we start playing the game, we're going to change this variable to true. So is auto playing, and we'll make it equal to true, because now we are auto playing. So now let's add the else branch to this statement. Else, curly brackets. So now we need to stop this interval. So how do we do that? The answer is that set interval actually returns a number, and this number is like an ID. We can use this ID to stop the interval. So at the front, let's create a variable to save this ID. Const interval ID and equals. However, there's another problem here. Every time we run the function, we're going to get a different ID. So in order to save the ID from last time, we need to put this variable outside the function. So let's select this and remove it for now. And we'll scroll up. And here, we'll create the variable let interval ID. And we'll leave it undefined to start. And now down here, we're going to save the return value into this variable by typing interval ID equals set interval. And now at the bottom, we're going to use the interval ID to stop the interval. Let's scroll down. And to stop an interval, we can use a function called clear interval. So we'll type clear, capital I, interval, and brackets. And between the brackets, we're going to give it an ID that we want to stop. So we'll give it this interval ID. Interval ID. And then at the bottom, let's also change is autoplaying to false because we just stopped it. So is auto playing equals false and save. So now if we try out this button, it will start playing the game by itself every second. And if we click the button again, it will stop playing the game. So that's how we stop an interval. We need to save the ID and then call clear interval with this ID. So now I'll clean up the code a little by removing this extra line and save. And now we're finished with this feature. So next, let's go back to our advanced functions file. So I'll click up here, and then at the bottom, I'll open 12 advanced functions and hide the files for now. And we're going to learn some more features of functions as values. So let's actually close the other files that we opened. And first, let's comment out the previous code with /* and at the bottom, */. Let's scroll down and save. And let's open the tab for this file. So now we're going to learn another way to loop through an array. First, let's create an array. We'll type square brackets, and inside the array, we'll have the string make dinner and another string wash dishes and another string watch YouTube. So in the previous lesson, we learned how to loop through an array using a for loop or a while loop. Another way to loop through an array is using a method of the array called for each. So at the bottom, let's type dot for capital E each and brackets. So this is the for each method, and it allows us to loop through this array. Inside these brackets, we're going to give for each a function. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. So again, we're just passing a function into another function. However, this function will be a little different. We're going to give it a parameter. So up here, let's create a parameter called value. So what for each does is that it loops through the array, and for each of these values, it will save the value in the parameter and run the function. So let's console.log value and save. So this will loop through the array and display each value in the console. So let's go through this step by step. So it'll take the first value, save it in this parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the second value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. Then it will take the third value, save it in the parameter, and run the function. So the for each method is actually the preferred way to loop through an array, because this is easier to read than a for loop like this. And for each also has another feature. We can give this function a second parameter. So we can type comma, and the second parameter is the index, or the position of the value in the array. So for the first value, index will be 0. For the second value, index will be 1. third value, index will be 2, and so on. So above this line, let's also console.log the index and save. And this will also display the index of each value. All right, now let's do a practical example using the for each method. We're going to go back to the to-do list project that we created in the previous lesson. So we'll click up here to show our files, and let's scroll up, and let's open 11todolist.js. So in this code, we used a for loop to display the to-do list on the page. We're going to switch this to using a for each method instead. So first, let's actually make a copy of the files for this project. We'll click up here, and let's click 11 to-do list, and right-click, copy, and let's click the script folder, right-click, and paste. And now we'll rename this by right-clicking, rename, remove copy from the end, and change the beginning to 12, and press enter. Let's also make a copy of the CSS and HTML file for this project. So we'll click the CSS file, right-click, copy, click the styles folder, right-click, and paste. Right-click, rename, remove copy, and at the front, change it to 12, and press enter. And finally, we'll scroll down, click 11todolist.html, right-click, copy, and then down here, right-click and paste. Right-click, rename, remove copy at the end, and at the beginning, change it to 12, and press enter. Now we can hide these files, and we can close the lesson 11 files. And now here, we're going to change the CSS file that we load to 12 to-do list. And we'll scroll down, and we'll also change the JavaScript file that we load to 12 to-do list. Now let's save, and we'll open this in the browser by right-clicking, open with live server. Okay, now let's go back to the JS file. So I'll take this file and drag it to the bottom, and I'll rearrange the windows here. We're going to scroll down, and we'll change this for loop to use a for each method. So first, let's type above this for loop, and we'll type the array that we want to loop through, which is to-do list. And we'll type dot and use the for each method and brackets. Inside the brackets, we'll give it a function that we want to run for each to-do. So we'll type function, brackets, and curly brackets. And this function can have two parameters. The first parameter will contain each value in the array. So we'll call it to-do object. We'll type a comma, and the second parameter contains each index in the array. So we'll just call it index. And now inside this loop, we basically want to do everything that we did here. So let's just make a copy of this code, right-click, copy, and then up here, inside for each, right-click, and paste. So now if we scroll up, we already have the to-do object up here. So we don't need to get it from the array like before. So we can remove this line. And let's also remove these comments. The other thing we have to change is that previously we were using I for the index, but now the index is called index. So we just change this to index. So that's how we use a for each method instead of a for loop. if we compare this code to the for loop that we had before, the for each method is easier to read. So for the rest of this course, we're going to prefer to use for each instead of a for loop. So we're going to remove this for loop. Let's scroll back up and save, and the project still works. So that's a practical example of using the for each method. Now let's go back and learn some more details about for each. We'll close the JavaScript file for now and go back to advancedfunctions.html and open the tab for this file. So in the previous lesson, we learned a feature of loops called continue. Continue lets us skip to the next iteration or the next run of the loop. For each methods don't have continue, but we can do the same thing with a return statement. So let's say in this loop, we don't like washing dishes. If the value is wash dishes, we're going to skip it and not display it in the console. So above, we'll create an if statement. And then inside the condition, we'll check if value is equal to the string wash dishes. And then in the curly brackets, if it is equal, we'll return and semicolon. So this return statement will end this function early, and it will go on to the next function. So it basically does the same thing as continue in a for loop. If we save, you'll notice that it skipped wash dishes. In the previous lesson, we also learned a feature of loops called break. Break lets us exit a loop early. Unfortunately, there's not an easy way to break in a for each loop. So if we need to use break to exit this loop early, then it's better to use a regular for loop. Let's take a break before continuing with the rest of this lesson. Here are some exercises that will help you practice what we learned so far. So next, we're going to move on and learn a shorter way to write functions called arrow functions. So let's go to the bottom of this code. We'll create some new lines, and let's create a variable, const. And we'll name the variable arrow function. And we'll make it equal to brackets, equal, greater than, or an arrow, and then curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we'll type some code, console.log brackets and the string hello. And we'll put a semicolon at the end. So this is an arrow function. It works the same way as a regular function. For example, we can call this arrow function by typing the variable name, arrow function, and brackets. If we save, this line of code will run the code inside this arrow function and display hello. So arrow functions mostly work the same way as regular functions. So to compare them, let's actually type above this code. We'll create some new lines and type const regular function equals the word function, brackets, and curly brackets, console.log string hello. So these two syntaxes do the same thing. The difference is that instead of using the word function, an arrow function just uses an arrow. Now parameters work the same way in an arrow function. we just type the parameter between these round brackets. So here, let's type param, and here as well. If we want multiple parameters, it also works the same way. Up here, we can type comma param2, and down here, comma param2. And finally, return statements also work the same way. So in this function, we can return 5, and in the arrow function, we can also return 5. So now let's learn some differences between these two. Arrow functions have a few shortcuts that regular functions don't have. For example, at the bottom, let's create an arrow function using const, and we'll name it 1param, and make it equal to an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Now in this arrow function, we're going to give it one parameter, param. And inside the function, we'll console.log param plus 1. So when an arrow function only has one parameter, these round brackets are optional. So we can actually remove them. If we do 1param brackets 2, if we save, it will display 2 plus 1, which is 3. Let's learn another shortcut. We'll create some new lines and type const 1 line and make it equal to an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And inside, we'll return 2 plus 3. So when an arrow function only has one line like this, we can actually put it on the same line as the arrow. And now that everything's on the same line, the curly brackets are actually optional. So we can remove them, and we can also remove the return statement. So this is a one-line arrow function. If we just have an arrow, it will automatically return the result on the right. So at the bottom, we can console.log and call the one-line function with brackets. If we save, this function will return 2 plus 3, and it will display 5 in the console. So that's arrow functions. It's a shorter way of writing a regular function, and it has a few shortcuts. For now, let's get some practice using arrow functions. So let's scroll up in this code to the for each method. So let's use an arrow function here instead. We just have to remove the word function, and after the round brackets, add an arrow, equals greater than. If we save, the loop still works. So when we're passing a function into another function like for each, it's recommended to use arrow functions because it makes our code easier to read. So now let's use arrow functions in some of our previous projects. We'll start with the rock, paper, scissors game. Let's open our files by clicking here, and we'll find the 12 rockpaperscissors.js file. And then inside this file, we're going to scroll down to the autoplay function. So here, we're passing a function into another function. So it's recommended to use an arrow function. Let's remove the word function and add an arrow. So now this code is a little easier to read. Now, what about this function up here? Function autoplay. Should we also switch this to an arrow function? So this situation is more personal preference. So above this, let's actually create an arrow function version of this. Const autoplay equals brackets and arrow, and curly brackets. So even though we could create an arrow function version of this, I actually prefer the regular function syntax here for two reasons. Number one, I think this is easier to read than this. And number two, this function syntax enables hoisting, which means we can call this function before we create it, and we don't have to worry about which order we write the code. So for these reasons, I actually prefer this situation to use a regular function syntax and not an arrow function. So we'll comment out the arrow function using // and //. Now let's save, and let's open the tab for this project, and we'll give it a try. So click autoplay, and this still works after replacing with an arrow function. Next, let's go to the to-do list project and switch to arrow functions. So we'll go to our code editor and find the to-do list project, which is here. And let's scroll down. So inside render to-do list, we're using for each, and we're passing this function into another function. So it's recommended to use an arrow function here. So we'll remove the word function, and after the brackets, we'll add an arrow. And again, I'll leave this function syntax as a regular function because it's easier to read and enables hoisting. So let's save and go back to our to-do list, and everything still works. Next, let's go back to 12 advanced functions.html, and we'll scroll to the bottom, and we'll open the tab for this file, and we'll review another place we could use arrow functions, which is inside an object. So at the bottom here, let's create a new object, const object2 equals object. And then inside, let's type the property method, colon, and an arrow function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So even though we could save an arrow function inside an object like this, objects already have a shortcut for functions. So at the bottom, we could just type method, brackets, and curly brackets. So this syntax is called the shorthand method syntax. So this shorthand method syntax is actually easier to read than an arrow function. So when saving a function in an object, it's actually recommended to use this syntax instead. There's also another difference between regular functions and arrow functions, but we'll learn about it later in this course because it's a more advanced feature. Now let's move on, and we're going to learn another improvement we can make to our projects. So let's comment out this code. We'll scroll up and type /*, and at the bottom, */ and save. And next, we're actually going to scroll up to the very top of this file. And we're going to create a button on the page. So inside the body, we'll type less than button greater than. And inside the button, we'll have the text click. Now let's say that we want to run some JavaScript code when we click this button. So here, we can type on click equals double quotes and write some JavaScript inside this double quotes. Now we're going to learn a better way of doing this called add event listener. To use add event listener, first we're going to get this button and put it into our JavaScript using document.querySelector. So let's add a class to this button so we can select it, and we'll set it to js-button. And now inside the script element, we're going to use document.querySelector, brackets, and the string dot js dash button. So now let's save this button in a variable so we can use it later. At the front, we'll type const button element equals this result. Now every HTML element has a method called addEventListener. addEventListener lets us run some code when we interact with the element. So it sort of does the same thing as onClick. So at the bottom, let's type button element dot add capital E event capital L listener and brackets. So addEventListener has two parameters. The first parameter is the event, or what type of interaction we want to listen for. So between these brackets, let's type the string click. So this will run some code when we click the button. The way to find these event names is to look at this attribute. The word after on is the event. Next, the second parameter is a function that we want to run when we click this element. So we'll type a comma, and because we're passing a function into another function, we're going to use an arrow function. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So inside here, let's just do console.log string click and save. And now when we click this button, it will run this function and display click. So this code does the same thing as the onClick attribute. However, addEventListener has some advantages over using an attribute. First, it lets us add multiple event listeners for an event. For example, let's add another click event listener. We can select this code and right-click, copy, and then down here, right-click and paste. And let's change this to log click 2. If we save and click the button, it will run both these functions. So addEventListener lets us add multiple listeners to one event. Another advantage of doing this is that we can remove an event listener using a method called removeEventListener. So under this code, we can type button element dot remove capital E event capital L listener and brackets. And removeEventListener also has two parameters. The first parameter is the event. So in this case, it is the string click. And we'll type a comma. And the second parameter is the function that we want to remove, so that when we click this button, it will no longer run that function. Now, we can't just type a copy of this function. We need to use this exact function inside removeEventListener. To do that, we'll save this in a variable first. So above this, let's create a variable const event listener equals, and we'll select this code, right-click, copy, and in here, right-click and paste. And now we'll replace this with the variable event listener. And down here, we'll remove this same variable, event listener. If we save and click the button again, it will only display click 2 because we added this event listener and then we removed it. So it will no longer run this function when we click the button. So as you can see, addEventListener gives us more control over event listeners. we can add multiple listeners to an event, and we can also remove a listener from an event. So because of these advantages, the best practice is to use add event listener instead of an on-click attribute. So let's go back into our projects and switch to using add event listener. We'll start with the rock, paper, scissors project. So we'll open our files and we'll open 12 rock, paper, scissors and click here and save. And we'll scroll up to 12 rock, paper, scissors.js. And for the video, I'll drag this down to the bottom. And I'll hide the files for now. And then rearrange the windows. And finally, open the tab for this file. Now let's go to the HTML. We'll scroll up to these move buttons, which is up here. So here, we're using the on-click attribute, and we're going to switch it to add event listener. So first, let's get this button into our JavaScript. We'll add a class so we can select it, js-rock-button, and save. And then down here, let's go below the autoplay function right here. And we'll use add event listener. So we'll get this button into our JavaScript using document.query selector brackets and a string dot js-rock-button, and we're going to use dot add event listener brackets. So we're going to listen for a click and a comma, and we'll give it a function that we want to run. So a common mistake here is to actually run the function. For example, play game brackets and the string rock. So we're supposed to give a function to add event listener. However, this doesn't result in a function. This will actually run play game and give us the return value, which is undefined. So this code will actually result in undefined, and then we're giving undefined to add event listener, so it won't work. So in order to give add event listener a function, we need to create a function here. So let's remove this code, and we'll create a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And then inside this function, we're going to call play game. So we'll type play game, brackets, and rock. So now when we click the rock button, it will run this function and play the game. So let's remove the on-click attribute and save the HTML and also save the JavaScript, and then go to our project and click the rock button. You can see that it works, except this time we're using add event listener. So let's do the same thing for the paper and the scissors button. Feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself. So we'll scroll down here and let's add a class to the paper button so we can select it, js-paper-button, and then in our JavaScript, we'll make a copy of this code. So right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. And now we're going to replace the rock button with paper. And when we click this button, we're going to play the game with paper. Now let's save, and we'll remove the on-click attribute and save the HTML. If we click the paper button, it works as before. Finally, let's do the scissors button. So we'll add a class js-scissors-button, And then inside our JavaScript, we'll make a copy of this, right click, copy, and then down here, create some new lines, right click, and paste. And now switch to the scissors button and play game with scissors. Let's save and remove the onClick attribute. Save the HTML and try the scissors button. So everything still works. And I'll leave switching the reset score button and the auto play button as exercises. So now let's try add event listener with a different event. We'll use it with key down. So let's say that in our project, we want to make it so we can play the game with our keyboard. If we type R, it will play rock. If we type P, it will play paper. And if we type S, it will play scissors. Let's go into our JavaScript and we'll scroll down. And we're going to add an event listener to the body this time, so that if we type anywhere on the page, we can run some code. So we're going to get the body element using document.body and then .add event listener and brackets. This time, the first parameter or the event will be the string key down. And let's type comma and give it a function that we want to run. Brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. Inside here, let's just type console.log key down for now and save. So now if we go to the project and we open the console, right click and click inspect, click the console, and then click on the page. If we type a key on our keyboard, it will run this function and display key down. So now we have to check what key was pressed and play the game. So how do we know which key that we pressed? Earlier in this course, we used the attribute onKeyDown, and we learned that it gets a special object called event, and the event object contains which key was pressed. Add event listener also provides this event object, but it provides it as a parameter to this function. So inside the round brackets, let's add a parameter event. Now every time we type on our keyboard, add event listener will save the event object in here and run the function. And this event object contains the key that we pressed. So in the console.log, let's display event.key this time and save. Now if we click on the page and type R, event.key will contain R. If we press P, event.key will contain P. So that's how we know which key we pressed. So now let's close this. And instead of console.log, we'll create an if statement to check which key we pressed. So if brackets and curly brackets. And here we'll check if event.key is equal to the string R. If it is, we're going to play the game with rock. So inside here, we can just run this play game function. Play game and brackets, and inside we'll type the string rock. Now let's check if we pressed P. So we'll add another branch, else if brackets and curly brackets. And in the second condition, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string P. If it is, we'll play the game with paper. So inside here, we'll run play game brackets and the string paper. And finally, we'll check if we pressed S. So at the end, we'll add another else if brackets, curly brackets, And inside here, we'll check if event.key is equal to the string s. If it is, we'll play the game with the string scissors. Now let's save, click our page, and type R, and it plays a game with rock. If we type P, it will play the game with paper. And if we type S, it will play the game with scissors. So that's an example of using add event listener with a different type of event with a key down. If we need the event object, we can get it using a parameter up here. So those are all the features we're going to create for our rock, paper, scissors project. Now let's move on to the to-do list project and switch to add event listener. We'll go into our code editor, click up here, and find 12 to-do list.html. We'll also scroll up to the scripts folder, find 12 to-do list.js, and open this file. And I'm going to put it at the bottom here so I can see it side by side. I'll close this for now and close rock, paper, scissors, and then open the tab for this project. Okay, so let's start by switching the add button to use add event listener. We'll go into our HTML and find the add button, which is here, and we're going to add a class so we can select it in JavaScript. js-add-to-do-button. Now let's go to our JavaScript and scroll down. Above the add to do function, we'll get this button into our JavaScript using document.query selector brackets and then a string dot and the class we want to get, js-add-to-do-button. And then after this, we'll use .add event listener brackets. Inside these brackets, we'll give it the event, the string click, comma, and then a function to run when this event happens. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And in here, we just want to do the same thing as the onClick attribute, which is add to do and call this function. Let's save. And then in the HTML, let's remove the onClick attribute and save. And let's try it out. So we'll type a to do, watch YouTube, select a due date, and then click add. And the add button still works as before, but we're just using add event listener. Next, let's switch all the delete buttons. Let's scroll up to where we create these delete buttons, which is here. And first, we'll add a class to all the delete buttons so we can select them in JavaScript. js-delete-to-do-button. And now we're going to use document.query selector and add an event listener to all of these buttons. However, there's two problems here. First is that at this point in the code, this is just a string. We haven't actually put this button on the page yet. We do that down here in this line of code. We put the HTML that we generated onto the page. So in order to add an event listener, we need to put the HTML on the page first. So we have to do it after this code. So down here, we're going to type document.query selector brackets and the string dot, and we'll select this class, js-delete-to-do-button. However, there's also a second problem here, which is we're going to have multiple delete buttons. and query selector only gives us the first one. So how do we select all the buttons on the page that match this criteria instead of just the first one? To do that, the document object has another method called query selector all. So query selector all will give us all the elements on the page that have the class JS delete to do button. So down here, let's console.log this result to see what it looks like. Console.log brackets and close bracket and save. And then here, right click, inspect, and the console, and expand this. You'll see that document.querySelectorAll gives us a list of elements. And this list works just like an array. This is index 0, or the first button, and this is index 1, which is the second button. So now let's remove console.log and add event listeners to all of these buttons. To do that, we're going to loop through this list of delete buttons. So again, this list works like an array, so we can use a for each method to loop through it. So at the end, let's type enter and tab, and then dot for each and brackets. As usual, we'll give for each a function that we want to run for each of these values. So we'll type brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. And now every time we loop through the list, for each will give us two parameters. The first one is a value in the list, which is a delete button element. So let's name it delete button. And we'll type comma, and the second parameter is the index. So index. So now we want to add an event listener to each delete button. So inside here, we'll type delete button dot add event listener and brackets. Inside these brackets, we'll tell it what event we want to listen to, which is the string click and comma, and then a function that we want to run when this event happens. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So now when we click a delete button, we want to do the same thing as this onClick attribute above. So let's select this code. We'll right click, copy, and then down here, right click and paste. And now we can remove these characters because we're not in a string anymore. And that's all we need to do. So to summarize, we used query selector all to get a list of all the delete buttons on the page, and then we looped through the list using for each. And for each delete button, we added a click event listener and ran the same code that we did before. So now we can scroll up and remove this onClick attribute and save, go back to the page, close the console, and try out the delete button. And you can see that it still works. So that's how we switch the to-do list project to use add event listener. So now we're finished improving all of our projects. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn more features that use functions as values. So let's close this for now, and we'll go back to 12 advanced functions.html. And we'll open the tab for this file. And let's also comment out this JavaScript code using /* and */. Let's save. And now let's scroll to the bottom of this code and create some new lines. So in this lesson, we learned the array method for each, which lets us loop through an array. Now we're going to learn two more array methods called filter and map. So let's start with filter. Let's say we have an array of numbers and we want to create a copy of this array with all the negative numbers removed. So let's go up here and create an array of the number 1, comma, -3, comma, 5, and type the method dot filter and brackets. So filter works the same way as for each. We give it a function, so bracket, arrow, and curly bracket, and this function has two parameters, the value and the index. So filter will take the first value, save it in here, and run the function. Then it will take the second value, save it in here, run the function, and the third value, save it, and run the function. Now the only difference is that this time, this inner function will return a value. So we'll type return. And we're going to return a Boolean, like true. So now the return value matters. So what filter does is it creates a new array. If the inner function returns true, it will put this value in the new array. If the inner function returns false, it will not put this value in the new array. For example, at the front, let's console.log the result of this. So we'll type console.log, open bracket, and down here, close bracket, and save. So in this example, the inner function always returns true, so all three values will be in the new array. If we change the return value to false every time and save, all three values will not be added to the new array. So now let's use this to solve our problem. We want to remove the negative numbers from this array. So inside this inner function, we're going to return true if the number is positive and return false if the number is negative. So we'll check if value is greater than or equal to 0, curly brackets, we'll return true and include it in the new array. Else, we'll return false and not include it in the new array. So let's remove this and save. So now only values that are greater than 0 will be in the new copy. So using this, we can sort of filter out values based on a criteria. That's why this method is called filter. Now we can shorten this logic by using this code. Return value greater than or equal to 0. So this comparison will return true if it's greater than or equal to 0, and it will return false otherwise. So this line does the same thing as this code up here. So we can comment this out with /* and // and save. And as always, we can return a truthy or falsy value instead of just true or false. The last array method we're going to learn is called map. So let's create some new lines and scroll down. And let's say we have an array of numbers again, like the array 1, 1, 3. And we want to make a copy of this array with each number doubled. So at the end, we'll type dot map brackets, and map works just like for each and filter. Between the brackets, we'll give it a function, bracket, arrow, and curly brackets. And this function will get two parameters. The first parameter is each value in the array, and the second parameter, comma, is the index. So map will take the first value, save it in this parameter, and run the function. Take the second value, save it in this parameter, run the function. Third value, save it, and run the function. And inside this function, we're going to return a value. So what map does is it creates a new array, and then whatever we return will be added to the new array. So if we return 10, and then we console.log this result, console.log, and close bracket, and save, it will create an array where each value becomes 10. Now, the interesting thing is that we can actually use the value itself in the return. So here, if we did value plus 10 and save, it will take each value in the original array, add 10, and put it in the new array. So map will transform an array into another array based on the return value. So if we want to return an array where each number is doubled, we just have to multiply each value by 2 and save. And this will give us 2, 2, 6. Next, we're going to review some shortcuts of arrow functions to make this code more compact. First, let's make a copy of this code. Right-click, copy, and down here, right-click and paste. So notice in the inner function, we're not using index. So let's just remove it for now. And now that this arrow function only has one parameter, these round brackets are optional. So we can also remove these to make the code more compact. Another shortcut is if we only have one line of code in an arrow function, we can put the code on one line like this. And now the curly brackets and the return are optional. So we can actually just remove all of this code. So if we have just an arrow, it will automatically return this result on the right, and we don't have to type return ourselves. So this code does the same thing as the code above. But as you can see, these shortcuts make our code very compact and clean. So let's save, and this will give us the same result. The last thing we're going to learn in this lesson is a feature of functions called a closure. A closure means if a function has access to a value, it will always have access to that value. So let's take a look at an example. We're going to go back to the to-do list project. So we'll click up here and then scroll up to 12todolist.js and close this, and then open the tab for the to-do list, which is here. And let's scroll down to the query selector all. So we're going to focus on this inner function here. So notice that this function uses index from above. Now the interesting thing about index is that as soon as this for each ends, index gets deleted. For example, if we add some new lines and we try to console.log index and save, and then go into our project, right-click, inspect, and the console, it'll tell us that the index is not defined. So as soon as we end the for each loop, index doesn't exist anymore. However, if we move this into the inner function, so inside here, and we console.log index and save, and we click a delete button, it will tell us that the index is 0. So even though index gets deleted right away down here, if we click one of these buttons later on, it still has access to index. This feature is called a closure. If a function has access to a value, it will always have access to that value. The value, like index, gets packaged together or enclosed with the function. That's why we call it a closure. So even if the value index gets deleted after the loop, we can click the delete button 5 seconds later or even 5 minutes later, and this function will always have access to index. So closures are something that naturally happens as we write JavaScript code, and it's nice to know how this feature works. There are some advanced techniques that we can do with closures, but they're not used that often, so I won't be covering them in this course, but maybe in a different video. Now let's remove console.log and save. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we learned that functions are values. We learned set timeout and set interval, which lets us run a function in the future. We learned an array method called forEach, which is a cleaner way of looping through an array. We used forEach, arrow functions, and add event listener to improve our projects. We learned 2 more array methods, filter and map, and we learned a feature of functions called closures. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to start the Amazon project, and we're also going to learn a very useful technology called Git. So first, let's take a look at the Amazon project to see how it works. We're going to go to our browser and create a new tab at the top, and we're going to type supersimple.dev/projects/Amazon and press enter. So this is going to be the project we're going to build in this course. This is an e-commerce website that looks like Amazon, where we can see a list of products on the homepage, and then we can add these products to a cart by clicking Add to Cart. And then we can see our cart by clicking the top right. And on this page, it will show us which products are in our cart, and it will also show us the cost of our order, including shipping and taxes. And once we're ready to create an order, we can click this button to create the order, and it will take us to this page, which shows us a list of our past orders. We can also track our order by clicking this Track Package button, and it will take us to this page, which tells us the progress of our order, whether it's preparing, it's shipped, and it's delivered. So that's an overview of the project we're going to build. This is a complex multi-page website where the different pages interact with each other to create a full app. The first thing we're going to do is to download the starting code for this project. We're going to create a new tab, and here we're going to type github.com/supersimpledev/javascript-amazon-project and press enter. You can also find the starting code in the description by clicking here and then going to the links for this lesson. And on this page, we can see the starting code for the Amazon project. So this code contains all the HTML and CSS that we need. The reason we're going to use some starting code instead of writing all of this ourselves is because this course is focused on JavaScript, not HTML and CSS. If we were to write all of this code ourselves, it would just take up too much time, and it would be an entire course by itself. If you want to learn how to create this code, you can check out my HTML and CSS full course, which will teach you all the skills that you need. But for this JavaScript course, we're going to start with the HTML and CSS here, and we're just going to focus on adding JavaScript to this website. So now let's download all of this code. We can do that by clicking this green code button here, and then click Download Zip. Once that's finished downloading, we're going to go to our Downloads folder. So for me, it's this folder right here called Downloads. And then we're going to unzip this file by double-clicking it. And this will give us a folder that contains all the code. So we're going to select this folder and move it to our desktop. Next, let's go to our desktop. So we're going to close this for now, and I'll hide the browser. And on the desktop, we're going to select the folder that we downloaded, and we're going to rename this. So at the end, we'll remove main and press enter to rename it to JavaScript Amazon project. Next, we're going to take this folder and open it in our code editor. So let's open VS Code, and we're going to click File, Open Folder, and we're going to find the folder that we downloaded. For me, it's on the desktop, and it's this folder right here. So we'll click this folder, and then click Select Folder. And then we can close this welcome message. Okay, so now we have our starting code, and we're going to set up the project. So first, let's open our browser again, and we can close the GitHub page, as well as the tabs for the previous lessons. So we'll close these tabs right here, but we'll leave the final Amazon project open. Next, let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to open this project in our browser. So we're going to select this file, amazon.html. So this file corresponds to the home page here. So let's select this file, and then right-click, Open with Live Server. So I'm just going to rearrange my windows here so we can see these side by side. And now we're ready to begin. So let's take a look at the code that we have to start with. As I mentioned, all we have here is the HTML and CSS for this website. There's currently no JavaScript at all on this page. So one thing you'll notice is that we can actually create almost all of the website using just HTML and CSS. We actually don't even need JavaScript to create all of this. We're able to create the header at the top, as well as 3 products to start with. And this shows that HTML and CSS can pretty much create everything that we see visually on the website. Where JavaScript comes in is that JavaScript makes this website interactive. So right now, if we click the Add to Cart button, it looks pretty nice, but it doesn't actually do anything. And that's because we haven't added JavaScript yet. So the role of JavaScript is to make our website interactive after we created all the content and the styling. Now, before we begin adding JavaScript to this website, we're actually going to take some time and learn another very useful technology called Git. So Git is a technology that lets us track changes in our code. For example, do not follow along here, but let's say that I'm working on this website and I go into my code editor and I change some code here. So let's say that I add some code here, and then in this file, I'm going to delete some code. So I just select some code and delete it, and then save. And then in this file, I'm going to change some code at the bottom. So now, let's say that I made a mistake, and I want to undo all the changes that I just made. So how would I do that? How would I remember all the code that I changed in the different files? So right now, this is really difficult, and this is a problem that we run into in bigger projects. We're changing lots of code in different files, and it's really hard to keep track of what code has changed. And this is where Git comes in. Git lets us track changes in our code, and it helps us solve this problem. So here's what it looks like if I have Git set up in my project. I can go into this section of VS Code. This section is for Git. And then here, Git will tell me which files I changed. And if I click these files, it will tell me which lines I changed and exactly which code I changed. If I want to, I can click this button to reverse all the changes in this file. I can also click here to reverse all the changes in all the files. So as you can see, Git helps us track changes in our code, and it lets us easily undo our changes if we need to. And this technology is really useful in bigger projects, like this Amazon project, where we're going to be changing lots of code in many different files. So before we start this project, we're going to learn how to set up and use Git. The first thing we need to do is to install Git. To do that, we can go to this section of VS Code called Source Control. Now, if this section looks like this, with a button Initialize Repository, that means you already have Git installed. Otherwise, if you're on Windows, you can click this button and then click Open, or you can go to this website directly and then click this link to download Git. Once it's finished downloading, we're going to run the installer and then just go with the default options. If you're using a Mac, you can click up here and then type terminal and press enter. And inside here, you're going to type git and press enter, and then click this link and install Git. All right, after installing Git, we're going to restart VS Code. And make sure you have the Amazon project open. And now if we go into the Git section, it should look like this, with the button Initialize Repository. So now that we've installed Git, we're going to set up Git in our Amazon project. We can do that by clicking Initialize Repository. If this button doesn't work for you, you can also try going to the Terminal menu and click New Terminal. And then inside this terminal, type git init and press enter. So a repository is just a folder where changes are being tracked. By clicking Initialize Repository, this turns the current folder, which is JavaScript Amazon project, into a repository. And now all the changes inside this folder will be tracked by Git. So to start off, Git will tell us that all of these files are new files. And that's because we just set up this repository. So all of these files are considered new changes that we're starting to keep track of. Next, we need to configure a username and email with Git. Now don't worry, this information is not used anywhere online. This is just for Git to add an author to the changes that we make. So to configure a username and email, we're going to go to the top and open the Terminal menu and click New Terminal. And then inside here, we're going to type git config user.name and double quotes. Now, if this looks familiar to you and you've already done this before, you can skip this step and the next step. So between these double quotes, we'll pick a username that we want to use. So for me, I'll use super simple dev and press enter. And we'll also configure an email by typing git config user.email, double quotes, and between these double quotes, we'll put an email. So I'll put simon@supersimple.dev. and press enter. So now that we configured a username and email, we can close this terminal. Next, we're going to save these changes into Git so that Git will start tracking any new changes that we make. To save these changes, we're just going to type a message here describing what we changed. So let's just type the message, add the starting files. And then we're going to click commit. And if this pop-up shows up, we're going to click yes. So that will take all of our changes and save them into Git. So now that we've saved those changes into Git, any new changes that we add will start showing up here. So let's do an example, and let's change some code in a couple of different files for practice. So let's click this icon up here to show our code, and let's go into amazon.html, and we'll just change this title to Intro to Git and save. And then let's go into checkout.html. And at the top, let's actually remove the title and save. And then let's open orders.html. And at the top, let's just add something to the title, like page. If we save, and then go into the source control section, or the Git section, it will tell us all the changes that we just made in our code in the 3 different files. If we click one of these files, it will actually tell us exactly which code that we changed. Now, if your Git section looks like this, where the changes are on top of each other instead of side by side, if you want to, you can change this by clicking these 3 dots here, making sure that inline view is unchecked, and also unchecking use inline view when space is limited. So now it's very easy to undo this code. We can just take the code on the left and then copy paste it on the right to undo this change. We can also click here to undo all the changes in this file. And up here, we can also click this button to undo all the changes in all the different files. So that's an intro to Git. It helps us keep track of changes in our code, and it's very useful for bigger projects like this Amazon project, where we're going to be changing lots of code in many different files. If you want to learn about Git in more detail, you can check out my Git and GitHub full course in the video description. So now that we've set up Git, let's start the Amazon project. So first, make sure that this section is empty, and we've reversed all the changes that we made when practicing Git. Next, let's click this icon to show our files, and let's remove the previous code. And we're going to start in the amazon.html file. And let's close the Git page, and then open the tab for this file. It should say amazon.html up here. So we'll start by creating the list of products on the home page. So right now, we start with 3 products. If we go to the final project, we're going to add the rest of the products that you see here. And we're also going to make this interactive so that when we click the Add to Cart button, it will add this product to our cart. So let's go back to our project. And in order to create this, we're going to learn the main idea of JavaScript. So when using JavaScript, we usually do a 3-step process. The first step is to save the data. And then we generate the HTML. And finally, we make it interactive. Let's go through each step to create this list of products. So right now, we have 3 products on our page to start with, and we're going to add more products to this page. So let's start by finding the HTML for one of these products, because we can always just copy and paste this to create another one. Now we're going to learn a very important skill for bigger projects, which is how to find the code for something on this page. So let's say that we want to find the code for one of these products. We're going to right-click and click Inspect, and this will bring up the console. And I'm actually going to click these three dots and click this icon to move the console to a separate window so that we can see the whole web page. So now we're going to click this icon in the top left, and we're going to hover over and click the thing that we want to get the code for. So I want to get the code for this entire first product. So I'll click in this space, and this will tell us that the code for the product is this code, a div with the class product-container. So now we're going to take this class and then search for it in our code editor. So let's open VS Code, and we're going to type Control F on Windows or Command F on Mac to search for code in this file. So we're going to search for the class that we saw earlier, which is product-container. And this will take us to the code for one of these products. So we can actually click the arrow on the left to collapse this code, and we'll see another product container, which corresponds to the second product. We can click this arrow again, and we'll see a third product container, which corresponds to the third product. So that's how we find the code for something on the page. Now, to add another product to this page, one thing we can do is to take this HTML and just make a copy of it at the bottom of the page. However, this is not a good idea, because if we add lots of products, we're going to be copying this HTML over and over. And if we expand this, you can see that each product has a lot of HTML code. So we don't want to be copying all of this over and over again. It's going to be a lot of code, and it's going to be hard to manage. Instead, another strategy is to generate this HTML code using JavaScript. So let's learn how to do that. Before we can do that, we need to add JavaScript to this page. So we're going to create a JavaScript file. So let's click up here to show our files. And first, let's create a new folder to contain all of our JavaScript code. So let's name this folder Scripts and press Enter. Next, let's click on our folder, and we're going to click this icon to create a new file. And we'll name this file Amazon.js and press Enter. So this will be the JavaScript file for this HTML file. Next, inside this JavaScript file, let's type the code console.log hello, just to make sure that this works, and save. Next, we're going to load this JavaScript file in our HTML file. So let's go back to amazon.html, and then at the bottom of the code, we're going to scroll down, and then right above the closing tag for the body, we're going to add a script element. And we're going to give this element an attribute src or source equals double quotes, and we're going to load this JavaScript file. So this JavaScript file is in a folder called scripts. So here, we're going to type the folder name scripts and then a / to go into the folder, and we'll load the file amazon.js and save. So now let's go back to the page, and we'll open the console, right-click, Inspect, and then click the console, and it should display hello. So now we're loading JavaScript on this page. So let's open up VS Code again, and we're going to generate all of this HTML using JavaScript instead. So the first step in our process is to save the data. What does this mean? Data means information. So in this case, The data is the information about our products. For example, the product's name, the price, ratings, and the image. So right now, the information about the products, or the data, is inside our HTML. So in our code, if we click here to expand this element, you can see that the information about the products, for example, the name and the image, is inside the HTML. So what we need to do is to take this data and save it inside our JavaScript so that our JavaScript can use it. So let's go to our JavaScript file, and I'm just going to put it down here so we can see it side by side. And we're going to move this data into our JavaScript. So let's remove console.log, and let's create a variable to save the data. So we'll type const, and let's name it products, and make it equal. And now we want to create something that closely matches our data. So in this case, we have a list of products. So in here, we're going to create an array, because an array represents a list. And now each product in the list has many values, like an image, a name, and a price. So we're going to use an object to represent each product, because an object lets us group multiple values together. So inside this array, we're going to create an object using curly brackets. And now inside this object, we're going to save the data for the first product. So first, let's find the data in our HTML. We're going to search for the product's name by typing Control F or Command F, and we'll search for black and gray. And this will take us to the code for the first product. So this is the name of the first product. So let's actually scroll up, and we're going to get the image for the first product. And we're going to take this and save it in our JavaScript. So let's select this code. We're going to right-click, copy, and then inside this object, let's create a property called image, colon, and then here, right-click and paste. And let's save this as a string. So at the front, we'll type a single quote, and at the end, we'll type a single quote. So we just saved the image inside our JavaScript. Let's move on and save the name inside our JavaScript. So we'll scroll down, we'll select this code, and then right-click, copy, and in this object, we'll type comma and a property called name, colon, a string, and we'll right-click and paste. Next, we're going to save the rating into our JavaScript. So we'll type comma, and let's create a property called rating, colon. For the rating, there's actually two parts, the stars and the number of ratings that it has. So let's actually group these two values into an object, because these values are related to each other. So in here, we'll make the rating an object. And each rating will have the stars, and for the socks, it's 4.5, comma, and the rating will also have a count. And for the first product, it's 87. Next, let's save the price into our JavaScript. So we'll create another property called price. And for the first product, the price is $10.90. However, JavaScript has problems doing math with decimal numbers or floats like this. So a best practice when calculating money is to calculate in cents instead of dollars. So for this reason, we're going to save the price as cents. So we'll save it as 1,090 cents. As a reminder, $1 is equal to 100 cents. And because we're saving in cents, it's helpful to rename this property to price cents instead. So now if we scroll up, we just saved all the information or the data about the first product into our JavaScript. Next, let's go to the end here and type comma and create another object. And we're going to save the data for the second product into this object. So feel free to pause the video if you want to try it yourself first. So again, let's find this product in our HTML. We'll go to our HTML and type Control F or Command F to search for code. And we'll search for the name intermediate size basketball. So now this is the code for the second product. We're going to scroll up a bit and find the image for this product, and we're going to select it, right click, copy, and then inside the second object, we'll create an image property, just like we did up here. And we'll save it as a string, and we're going to right click and paste. And let's type comma, and we'll save the name inside the second object. So we'll scroll down and select the name, and then right click, copy, and then down here, create a string, and right click and paste. And we'll type a comma, and we'll save the rating colon object, and we'll save the number of stars, which is 4, and the number of ratings that it has, count colon 127. And finally, we'll type a comma, and we'll save the price of the product in cents, colon 2,095 cents. So now the data for the second product is saved inside our JavaScript. Let's go to the end and type comma and create another object. And we're going to save the data for the third product inside. Again, feel free to pause the video to try it yourself first. So let's save the image. We'll find the code for this product in our HTML. So up here, we'll type Control F or Command F, and we'll search for the product name, which is Adults Plain Cotton T-shirt, and scroll up, and we're going to save the image first. So let's select this, right click, copy, and then down here, create an image property, colon, and a string, and then right click and paste. And we'll create a comma, and let's save the name in our JavaScript next. Create a string, and then we'll scroll down here. We'll select the name, right click, copy, and then in here, right click and paste, and comma, and we'll save the rating, colon, and object, and we have the number of stars. For this one, it's 4.5, colon, and the count. And for this one, it is 56. And lastly, type a comma, and we'll save the price in cents, colon, $7.99. And now let's save our JavaScript file. Now, one really important thing is to make sure that in each of these objects, we have the same properties. So we have the image property, the name property, and the same rating property with the same structure. We want all of our objects to have the same structure so that our code can handle each product the same. So that's what it means to save the data. We create something in JavaScript that closely matches the data that we have on the page. By the way, this is called a data structure because it structures or organizes the data. and this represents a list of products. So we usually use a combination of objects and arrays to create a data structure in JavaScript. So now that we've saved the data, the next step is to use this data to generate the HTML instead of writing the HTML manually. To generate the HTML, we can loop through this array. And for each of these products, we're going to create some HTML. So let's go ahead and loop through this array first. We'll scroll down to the bottom, and we'll type the name of the array, which is products, and then we'll loop through this array using a for each method. So we'll type dot for capital each brackets, and inside we'll create a function using brackets, arrow, and curly brackets, and we'll give it a parameter called product. So I'm going to move this back to the top here so we can see more of the code. So the way that for each works is that it takes each object, saves it in this parameter called product, and then runs the function. So it takes the first object, saves it in product, runs a function, takes the second object, saves the product, runs a function, and so on. So for each of these products or each of these objects, we want to create some HTML. So inside this function, let's create a variable, const HTML equals, and we'll create a template string using backticks. And now inside this template string, we're basically going to copy all the HTML for one of these products. So let's go back to our HTML file. And how do we find the HTML for one product? So we learned this earlier. We can right-click, inspect, and then click the top left icon, and click the element we want to get the HTML for. So this HTML represents one product, and we can search for this class product-container in our code. So we'll go back to our VS Code. Inside the HTML file, we can Control F or Command F to search for code, and we'll search for the class product-container. And let's go to the first result. So we'll go to the first result, which is here, and let's copy all of the code inside this element. One trick we can do is to click the arrow on the left to collapse it, and then we'll select all this code, and we'll right-click, copy, and then inside our JavaScript file, inside the string, we're just going to right-click and paste the HTML. And if we need to fix the formatting, we can select all of this code and then press Tab a few times to add some indents. And here we can remove the indent. And let's save. So now we're basically looping through the array of products, and for each product, we're creating all of the HTML that we had before. So we're generating this HTML using JavaScript. Now let's console.log this HTML to make sure that it's working. We'll scroll down to the bottom, and here, let's console.log the HTML that we just created. If we save and then go back to our page, right-click and inspect, and click the console, you can see in the console that we just generated all this HTML, and we generated 3 of these. Let's go back to our code and scroll up. Now, one problem here is that in the HTML that we generate, we don't want to have the name black and gray socks every time. For the second product, we want to have a different name and a different image. And for the third product, we want to have a different name and a different image. So how do we create slightly different HTML for each product? To do that, we're going to replace this part of the code with whatever the image property is. So for here, we're going to delete it, and we're going to insert the property image into this string. So to insert values into a template string like this, we can use $ open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And then inside here, we're going to insert the product dot image property. So it's going to take whatever the image property is of the product and put it inside this HTML code. Same thing for the name. Instead of black and gray socks every time, we're going to delete this and then insert a value. We're going to insert the product dot, and we'll insert the name property this time into this HTML. So dot name. And we'll do the same thing for the other pieces of data. So for each product, the number of stars could be different. So instead of 4.5 every time, let's delete this, and we're going to insert the product's rating and stars. So product dot rating dot stars. One thing we have to watch out here for is that this image has to exist. So right now, if we substitute the product.ratings.stars into this, we will get this image. And if we go into our files by clicking here and open the images folder and then open the ratings folder, we can see that there's no image called rating-4.5. Instead, there's an image called rating-45. So if the rating is 4.5, we should convert it into 45 so that this image actually exists. Similarly, if the rating is 4, we should convert it into 40 so that this image actually exists. So in here, we should actually multiply this by 10 so that this points to an actual image that exists here. Next, let's move on. And we'll work on replacing the count. So we'll remove this and $ curly brackets, and we'll replace it with the products dot rating dot and the count property. So count. And finally, we're going to replace the price for each product. So in here, we're going to remove this and substitute product dot price cents. And remember that this is a number in cents, but when we display it on the page, we want to display it as dollars. So we're going to divide this by 100 because there are 100 cents in each dollar. So now in the HTML that we're generating, we're actually inserting the details about each product. If we save and then go back to the console, right-click Inspect and Console, and look at the HTML that we generated, you'll see that it's different for each of the products. So that's how we use JavaScript to generate all the HTML here. So now the last step is we're going to combine all this HTML together into one string and put it on the web page. Let's go back into VS Code, and to combine all this HTML together, let's create a variable at the top for combining all the strings together. So we'll type let's call it products, capital HTML, and make it equal to an empty string to start. And then each time we go through the loop, we're going to add this HTML string up here. So instead of creating a new variable, we're just going to add products HTML equals itself products HTML plus this string. And remember, a shortcut for this is to just type plus equals. So this is called the accumulator pattern. We loop through an array, and each time we're adding to the result. So we're accumulating the result. And now that we combine all the HTML into this variable, we can scroll to the bottom. And let's remove this line because this doesn't exist anymore. And then after the loop, let's console.log the products HTML and save. And now if we go into our console, we combined all the HTML for all the products together. And now the last step is to take this HTML and put it on the page. And we can do that using the DOM. So let's go back into our code. And to use the DOM, we're first going to get an HTML element from the page and put it inside our JavaScript. So first, let's go to our HTML file. And remember that a product-container represents one of these products here. So we're going to look for this element here, a div products-grid. So this element contains all of our products. So we're going to use the DOM to take this element, put it into our JavaScript, and replace all the HTML inside. So to put this element in our JavaScript, we're going to give it a class. So let's add a class js-products-grid and save. And let's go into our JavaScript. So I'm just going to move this down to the bottom again so we can see it side by side. And then inside our JavaScript, at the bottom, we're going to use the DOM by typing document.querySelector, brackets, and a string. And we're going to type dot to select a class, and we're going to select js-products-grid. So the dot means we're going to look for a class called JS-products-grid, which is right here, and it's going to take this element and put it inside our JavaScript. And now we can change the HTML inside the element. To do that, we'll use the property .inner capital HTML, and we'll change it to the products HTML that we created above. So products capital HTML and save. So it's not going to look any different, but now we're actually generating all the HTML with JavaScript and then using the DOM to put this HTML inside here. So now we can actually delete all of this because we're generating this with JavaScript. If we save this file, our products will still be here because even though we deleted the HTML, we're now generating it with JavaScript. Now, one problem that I see here is that the price shows up with 1 decimal, but we actually want it to show up as 10.90. So let's scroll up to this part in the code. So we'll scroll up here and look for price cents. And the reason this happens is because price cents is 1090. So if we divide that by 100, the result is actually 10.9. If we want to force this to show 2 decimals, like 10.90, we actually have a special method that we can use with a number. So here, we can add brackets around this to make sure we calculate this number first. And numbers have a special method called .toCapitalFixed and brackets. So toFixed will convert a number into a string, but we can tell it how many decimals we want between the brackets. If we type 2, it will show 2 decimals. So if we save, now it shows correctly on the page. If you're wondering how to find this method, you can find it by searching in Google or using an AI tool. Okay, let's take a break here and take a look at Git to see all the changes that we made. So I'm going to expand this here, and we're going to click the Git section. And it's going to tell us that we changed 2 files. If we click the HTML file, Git will tell us that we deleted all of the HTML code for the products, which is correct. If we open the JavaScript file, Git will tell us that we added all of this new JavaScript code, including the data and the loop for generating the HTML. So Git helps us track all of the changes that we made. So now let's actually take these changes and save them into Git so we can track new changes. At the top, let's type a message to describe the changes that we made. So let's type generate HTML with JavaScript and click commit and yes if this shows up. So now let's talk about the benefit of generating the HTML. So let's close Git for now, and I'll move this to the side here. So the benefit of generating the HTML is that if we want to add another product, we don't have to copy paste all of this HTML again. All we need to do is to go up to the data and add the data for a new product. So let's do an example and add a 4th product to our list. So at the end here, let's type a comma and create another object. And let's go to the final project. And we'll scroll down to this 4th product here. So we're going to take the data about this product and save it in our JavaScript. So first, let's create a property image :string, and we're going to take this image and put it in here. To do that, we can right-click the image, inspect, and then we're going to copy this source attribute. So we can double-click it, and we can select this attribute, right-click, copy, and then inside our JavaScript, we're going to right-click and paste. And at the end, we'll type a comma and create the name property and a string, and we're going to select this name, right-click, copy, and then in here, right-click, paste, comma, and a rating property, :, and object. We have the stars, which is 5, and the count, which is 2,197. And at the end, we're going to add the price in cents, $1,899. So now if we save this JavaScript file and then go back to our project and we scroll down, you'll notice that it automatically added the 4th product. And all we had to do was to add another object to our array. And then our loop will handle generating all the HTML for us. So you can see that generating the HTML with JavaScript is a lot easier than copy pasting this HTML every time. And that's why we use this technique. Next, we're going to add the rest of the products in the final project. Now, one thing we could do is to manually copy this over one by one, but to make this easier, inside the starting code, I've actually created a file that contains all the data. So if we scroll up and close this for now, and we're going to go to this data folder and open it. And inside this folder, I've provided a JavaScript file called products.js. And in here, it contains an array with the data for all the products in the final project. So we don't have to create it ourselves. So now let's use this products array in our code. So first, we need to load this file on our page. We can go to our amazon.html file and then scroll down to the bottom. And then at the bottom in the script element, we're going to add another script element above it. So we'll type script, and then the source is going to be equal to this JavaScript file. So we'll type the folder called data, and then a slash to go into the folder and load the file products.js. So what this does is that it will run the files one by one. First, it will run the products.js file and create the array, and then it will run our amazon.js file and generate the HTML. So back here, let's save, and then go back into amazon.js. So now, instead of using our own products array, let's just use the products array in this file. So we'll go back to amazon.js, and we're just going to delete this array. So over here, we can click this arrow to collapse the code, and we're going to select it, and then just delete it. And save. So now this variable will be coming from this file. If we go back to our project and scroll down, you can see that we created all the products in our final project. So the way this works is that inside our amazon.html, we're loading two JavaScript files. This JavaScript file creates all the products, and then this JavaScript file loops through the products and creates all the HTML. So keep in mind that script elements are loaded one by one, so the order matters. We have to first create the products array, and then we can use it. If these two were reversed, then the code wouldn't work. So this is how a real-world website is created. We don't write all the HTML manually. Instead, we save the data for the website in a data structure like this, and then we use JavaScript to generate the HTML using the data. So now let's go into Git and look at our most recent changes. So here it will tell us that we changed two files. In the amazon.html file, we added a script element, and then in the amazon.js file, we deleted the products array that we created on our own. So let's type a message to describe our changes. Use products.js file, and then click commit, and yes. Now, one other thing I want to show you about Git is if we go back to our files here and then open amazon.js, Git has a really useful feature called a history. So we can open this timeline section and then click this filter icon and only check Git history. And now you can see that we actually have a history of all of our changes for this file. So if we click the first line in the history, it will show us that here we added all of the code, and then the second line in the history, we deleted this part of the code. So this gives us a step-by-step history of all the changes in our code. And in Git, this is called a version history. You can also see that the messages that we created when we commit show up here. And these messages help us understand what was changed in each version in the history. All right, so let's close this for now. And the last step in the process is to make it interactive. So let's take a look at our current project. So we'll go here and open this tab, and let's scroll up. So right now, if we click the Add to Cart button, it doesn't do anything. So we're going to add some JavaScript to make this interactive and actually add this product to a cart. So first, let's find the Add to Cart button in our code. We'll go back to our amazon.js file, close this for now, and to find the code, we can actually just search the text in the button. So inside here, let's type Control F or Command F, and we're going to search for the text add to cart. And this will take us to the code for this button. So now we're going to add an event listener to this button and make it do something when we click it. To add an event listener, we're first going to add a class js-add-to-cart, and then we're going to use the DOM to add an event listener to this button. So down here, after we've put this HTML on the page, we're going to use document.querySelectorAll, brackets, and then a string, a dot, and we're going to select all the js-add-to-cart. So js-add-to-cart. So this will give us a list of all the add to cart buttons on the page. And then we can loop through each of the buttons. So we can type dot for each, brackets, and then in here we'll give it a function, bracket, arrow, and curly brackets, and a parameter. So the parameter is going to be the button element that we got from the page. So now for each of these buttons, we're going to add an event listener so we can do something when we click the button. To do that, we'll type button.add-event-listener, brackets, and then the event that we want to listen for, which is the click event, and then a function that we want to run when we click this button. So brackets, arrow, and curly brackets. So for now, let's just console.log a message to make sure that this is working. So we'll console.log added product and save. And we can also remove this line for now because we're not using it. And save again. And then now on our page, we're going to click add to cart and then look inside our console. So right click, inspect, and click the console, and it displays added product. So now whenever we click one of these buttons, it will display this message. So that means that our code here is working correctly. Next, we need to figure out how to add the product to a cart, and we need to figure out what this looks like. If we think about a cart is basically just a list. And inside this list, we have the product that we want to buy and the quantity or the number of this product that we want to buy. So we can actually represent this in JavaScript as an array. Inside the array, we can have some objects, and each object is going to contain the product and a quantity. So we can use something like this to represent our cart. So let's go ahead and create this cart array. Now to keep things cleaner, let's actually separate the cart into its own file. So we'll click up here to show our files, and then we'll go into the data folder and click this folder and click this icon to create a new file. And we'll name this file cart.js and press enter. So this file will contain all the code relating to the cart. And the reason we separate it is to keep our code organized. Each file will focus on one particular thing. So inside cart.js, let's create our cart. So we can just create a variable const cart and make it equal to an array. So we'll start off with an empty cart. And let's save this file. And now we need to load this file into our HTML. So we can open amazon.html. And again, we can just add another script element. So let's add it at the top to make sure we load the cart before running the rest of our code. So we'll type less than script and the attribute source, and we'll load the data folder / to go inside cart.js and save. So now it will run this file at the start, and it will create an array representing our cart. So now that we have a cart, we need to figure out what happens when we click a button. How do we add a product to this cart? So let's go back into amazon.js and we'll figure this out together. So down here, this is the function that is run when we click the button. So in here, we have to figure out how to add this product to the cart. One way to do this is to just add an object to the cart, like this. We have the product's name and the quantity that we want. However, when we click this button, how do we know which product we're supposed to add to the cart? To solve this problem, we're going to learn a feature of HTML called a data attribute. A data attribute is just another HTML attribute, except the purpose of a data attribute is that it allows us to attach any information to an HTML element. So let's do an example and create a data attribute. We're going to scroll up to the Add to Cart button here, and then at the end of the opening tag, after the class, we'll type enter, and then we're going to type data dash. And then we can type any name that we want, like product dash name. And we'll make it equal to double quotes. And then inside the double quotes, we're going to put the product's name, like a basketball or a t-shirt. So to do that, we're going to insert using $ and curly brackets, product dot name, and save. So now let's inspect the HTML on the page. We're going to right-click on this Add to Cart button and inspect. And then in the Elements tab, it will show us the HTML for the button. And now you can see that each of these buttons now has a data attribute called data-product-name, and it's equal to the product name. So before we continue, let's learn the syntax rules for the data attribute. A data attribute is just an HTML attribute. That means it follows the same syntax rules. We have an attribute name on the left and an attribute value on the right. The one difference is that data attributes have to start with data dash. And then we can give it any name that we want, like product dash name. But we have to make sure to separate the words with a dash. This is also known as kebab case. So the purpose of a data attribute is that we can attach any information to an element. So here we attached the product name to this button, but we can also attach the product's image or the price and so on. So now that we attached the product's name to this button, when we click this button, we can actually get the name, and this will tell us which product we should add to the cart. So let's see what this looks like in our code. So we'll go to our code, and then when we click the button, we're first going to get the product name from the button. To do that, we're going to type button and then the property dot data set. So the data set property basically gives us all the data attributes that are attached to this button. So now we're able to get the product name. So let's console.log this to see what it looks like. Console.log, open bracket, close bracket, and save. And then in here, let's click the basketball's Add to Cart button, and we'll go into our console, right-click, inspect, and the console. And I'm just going to move this to the left so we can see it side by side with our code. So this is what the dataset property looks like. It gives us all the data attributes that are attached to the element. So in our case, we have the product name. Now this works just like an object. So to access the product name, we just have to type dot product, capital N, name. So notice that the name gets converted from kebab case to camel case. So now if we save, and let's go back to our website and click the Add to Cart button, it will get that data attribute from the button and display it in the console. If we click the Socks Add to Cart button, this will tell us which product we should add to the cart. So now that we have the product name, let's actually put this into our cart. So let's go into our code, and here, let's save the product name in a variable called const product name equals, and then here, we're going to add this to the cart. So we already created a cart variable here. So we're just going to type the variable cart, and we're going to dot push into the array. And let's push an object because we said we wanted a product and the quantity. So we'll add an object containing the product name, which is this variable product name, and a quantity of 1. And that's pretty much it. We first attached the product name to the button using a data attribute, and then when we click the button, we got the product name out. And then we add the product to the cart. So at the bottom, let's console.log the cart to see what it looks like. If we save and then go here and open the console, right-click, inspect console, and let's add a basketball to our cart. So we'll click here, and then in our cart, we now have a basketball with a quantity of 1. So now let's add another product to our cart. We'll go to the t-shirt and click Add to Cart. And now we have 2 products in our cart, 1 basketball and 1 t-shirt. So now we're successfully adding products to a cart. Next, let's try adding 1 t-shirt again. If we click Add to Cart, and unfortunately, this doesn't look quite right. The t-shirt product is repeated twice, and each of them has a quantity of 1. What we actually want to do is we want 1 t-shirt product with a quantity of 2, because this is how we're going to display it on the cart page. So let's figure out how to achieve this, and we'll do this step by step. First, we'll check if the product is already in the cart. If it is in the cart, we'll just increase the quantity by 1. If it's not in the cart, we'll add it to the cart. So let's convert these steps into code. So the first step is to check if a product is already in the cart. So how do we do that? Let's go back to our code. And one way to check this is we can loop through our cart and look for a particular product name. So up here, let's create some new lines, and let's check if this product name is already in the cart array. So we'll type cart, and we'll loop through the cart using dot for each, brackets, and then inside we'll give it a function, brackets, arrow, and curly brackets, and we'll give this a parameter, and let's just call it an item. So an item will contain a product name and a quantity. So we want to see if this product name is already in the cart. So we're going to check if the product name over here is equal to this item's product name. So we'll type equals the item dot product name and curly brackets. So if the product names match, that means this product is already in the cart. So let's save this matching item in a variable so we can use it later. So we're going to create the variable outside the for each loop. and outside of its scope. So we'll type let matching capital I item, and we'll make it undefined to start. And if we find a matching item, we're going to save it in this variable. So matching item equals item. So this is how we figure out if a product is already in the cart. Now the next step is if the product is in the cart, we'll just increase its quantity by 1. So we'll type if matching item and curly brackets. So we can just type matching item here, because if we did find a matching item, it will be an object, which is a truthy value. So in here, we're going to increase the matching item's quantity by 1 using matching item dot quantity, and we'll plus equals 1. And finally, if the product is not in the cart, we'll add it to the cart, which is basically what we do here. So at the end, we can just type else if we did not find a matching item, curly brackets, and we'll move this code. So we'll select it, right-click, cut, and then in here, right-click and paste. And remove the new lines and save. So now let's go into our project. We'll right-click, inspect the console, and let's click the Add to Cart button for the basketball. So we'll click this, and then in our cart, we have a basketball with a quantity of 1. Let's add a t-shirt, and now we have 1 t-shirt with a quantity of 1. And if we click Add to Cart on the t-shirt again, now we have a t-shirt with a quantity of 2. So that's how we solve the problem of combining the quantities together. Now there's one last problem that we have to solve here, which is it's not good to use the product name to identify the product in the cart, because in an e-commerce website, we might actually have 2 products that have the same name, but from different brands. So to fix this, we should give each product an ID. And this ID should be unique, so no 2 products will have the same ID. So let's use an ID to identify these products instead of using the name. We'll go back to our code, and if we open our files here and go to data.products.js, you'll notice that I've actually added an ID for each of these products, and this ID is unique. So I added it here to save us a bit of work, so we don't have to create the IDs ourselves. So now let's just use this ID in our code. So we'll go back to amazon.js, and then in here, instead of using the product name, we're going to use the product's ID to identify it in the cart. But first, we need to attach the ID to the button. So we'll scroll up, and instead of a data-product name attribute, we're going to use a data product-id attribute. And we're going to save the product's ID instead. And now down here, we're going to grab the ID from the button. To do that, we'll change this to product ID. So remember, this gets converted from kebab case to camel case. And we'll rename this variable product ID. And then here, we'll compare product ID is equal to the item's product ID. And lastly, when we add to the cart, we're just going to add the product ID to the cart. And save. So now if we go to our website and click Add to Cart and check our console and expand this, you can see that we're saving the product ID so that two products with the same name will be able to be added to the cart. Okay, so that's how we make the Add to Cart button interactive. And now we finished all three steps. First, we save the data for the website in our JavaScript, and then we use this data to generate the HTML. And finally, we made it interactive. And this is the main idea of JavaScript. This is generally how we use JavaScript on a real website. Now let's go back to Git. So we'll open our code editor and open the Git section and review the changes that we made. So we'll expand it, and then in the HTML file, we just added the cart.js file, and then in here, we just created the cart array. And in our amazon.js file, we basically added a data attribute to the button, and then down here, we made the button interactive by adding an event listener. So now let's save these changes into Git. We'll type a message to describe our changes, make add to cart button interactive, and click commit. All right, so let's close this for now. And the last feature we're going to create in this lesson is we're going to make this cart quantity in the top right interactive. So we'll do this step by step. First, we need to calculate the quantity, or the total number of products in our cart. And then we're going to put that quantity on the page here. So how do we calculate the total quantity of the cart? So remember that the cart is an array of objects, and each object has a quantity. So to calculate the total quantity, we can loop through this array and add the quantities together. Let's go into our code, and we'll open amazon.js, and let's scroll to the bottom. So here, after we update our cart, we're going to calculate the total quantity. So let's create some new lines. And as we saw earlier, we can loop through the cart array. So we'll type cart dot for each brackets and a function, arrow, and curly brackets. And we'll give this a parameter item. So this is going to loop through each object in the cart. Next, we need a variable to store the total quantity. So let's create a variable up here. We'll type let and name it cart quantity and make it equal to 0 to start. And then as we loop through this array, we're going to add the item's quantity to this variable up here. So here we can type cart quantity plus equals the items dot quantity. So this will add up all the quantities and save it in this variable. So at the bottom, let's console.log the cart quantity to make sure that this is working. So we'll save and go back to our page and open the console, right-click, inspect, and console. When we click add to cart on the basketball, the quantity will be 1. If we click add to cart on the t-shirt, the quantity will be 2. If we click again, the quantity will be 3. So looking at the cart, it basically added 1 basketball and 2 t-shirts to get a total of 3. So that's how we can calculate the total quantity of the cart. So now that we have the total quantity, we're going to put it on the page here. And we can do this using the DOM. So let's go back to our code. And to use the DOM, we first need an HTML element where we're going to put this quantity. So let's find the HTML element for this number here. We can go back to our page. We're going to right-click this number and then inspect. And then we can click this icon in the top left. hover over this number and click it. So this will tell us that the code for the number is this code right here, a div with a class cart quantity. So now we're going to search for this class cart quantity in our code. So let's go back to our code and let's go to the amazon.html file because the header is still in this file. And we'll type Control F or Command F to search for code, and we'll search for cart-quantity. And it will tell us that it's this line right here. So next, to use the DOM, we need to get this element into our JavaScript. To do that, we're going to add a class to this element. So let's add the class js-cart-quantity and save. Now let's go back to our JavaScript file, and I'm just going to move it down here so we can see it side by side. And we'll scroll down. After we calculate the quantity, let's get this element into our JavaScript using the DOM. So at the bottom, we'll type document.querySelector, brackets, and a string. We'll start with a dot and the class js-cart-quantity. And now that we have this element, we can change the HTML inside using the property .inner capital HTML, and we'll make it equal to the cart quantity that we calculated above. So let's save and go back to our website, and let's click the Add to Cart button for the basketball. Now it will update the quantity to be 1. Let's click the Add to Cart for the t-shirt. It will update the quantity again, and it will be 2. If we click it again, it will increase to 3. So now the cart quantity up here is interactive. The last thing we need to do is we'll go back to our HTML, and instead of starting at 3, the cart quantity should start at 0. So let's save. And now the cart quantity starts at 0. If we click Add to Cart, it will increase to 1. So that's how we create this cart quantity feature in the final project. So now we're finished all the features that we're going to do in this lesson. Let's go back to our JavaScript, and I'm just going to move it back up here. And let's clean up this code by removing these console.logs. And save. And finally, let's check Git one more time to see the changes that we made. So we can expand this and go to the Git section. If we click amazon.html, it will tell us we added this class. And if we click amazon.js, it will show us the code that we added for calculating the cart quantity and putting it on the page. So finally, let's type a message to describe our changes. Make the cart quantity interactive and commit. So now we can close this. And that's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we started the final Amazon project. We set up and learned how to use Git to track changes. We learned the main idea of JavaScript, which is save the data, generate the HTML, and make it interactive. We created a list of products on the homepage. We made the Add to Cart button interactive, and we made the cart quantity interactive. Thanks for watching this course so far. If you want to support this channel, you can check out the premium version of my courses just like this one, where you can get a certificate of completion and a better learning platform. If you're interested in extra videos from me, more in-depth videos, and behind-the-scenes content, you can check out these links here. You can also support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing this video with others. Thanks again, and let's continue with the course. Here are some exercises to help you practice what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn a feature of JavaScript called modules, which is a better way to organize our code. So first, let's take a look at a problem that we have in our current code. We're going to go to our files here, and we're going to open amazon.html. And then we're going to scroll to the bottom of this file to our script tags. So right now, we're using 3 script tags to run all of our JavaScript. So this runs all the code in cart.js, and then it runs all the code in products.js. And finally, it runs all the code in amazon.js. So this is basically the same thing as combining all the files together into one big file and then running all of our code. However, there's a big problem with using script tags like this. And that problem is it can cause naming conflicts. So in our situation here, we created a variable named cart in cart.js. This means we can't use the variable named cart in any of our other files. So for example, if we went to amazon.js and then we scroll to the top here, and let's say that we try to create another variable named cart. So at the top, we type const cart equals square brackets and save. And now if we go back to our project, you'll notice that the website stops working. And if we right click, inspect, and open the console, it will tell us that we got an error, and it says that cart has already been declared. So this is happening because we created a variable called cart in cart.js. And then later in amazon.js, we created another variable named cart. Now we can't have 2 variables with the same name in JavaScript, and this causes an error, and it causes our website to break. So this is called a naming conflict, when we have 2 variables with the same name. So the big problem with script tags is if we go back to our code, you can see here that it's really hard to tell which variables have been created in other files. And it's really easy to accidentally create a naming conflict like this. So that's the problem with using script tags like this and running our code one file at a time. It's very easy to get naming conflicts. So now we're going to learn how to solve this problem using a feature of JavaScript called modules. So a module basically contains a variable inside a file. So now this variable is not going to cause conflicts with anything outside the file. For example, in our project, we created a variable called cart, and we want to contain this variable inside the cart.js file so that it doesn't conflict with the cart variable inside the amazon.js file. So we can do this using a module. So now let's learn how to create our first module. We're going to go back to amazon.html, and then here, to create a module, we're simply going to delete this line of code that uses a script tag to load cart.js. So we'll delete it and save, and you'll see that the website is working again. So how does this work? When we use a script tag, it will run all the code inside cart.js. So this code will create a cart variable, and this will cause a naming conflict. By removing the script tag, we're no longer running the code inside cart.js. So we're no longer creating a cart variable, and it will no longer cause a naming conflict. So to create a module, we simply do 2 steps. Number 1, we create a file and write our code inside the file. And number 2, don't load the file with a script tag. By doing this, any variables we create inside the file will be contained inside the file, and it won't cause naming conflicts. So that's basically how we create a module. Okay, so now we run into another problem in our code. If we open amazon.js, we created this cart variable as an example, but what we actually want to do is to keep the cart variable inside cart.js, because we want to keep all the code that's related to the cart inside this file. So in amazon.js, we're going to delete this code. And if we save, and then go back to our project, and click Add to Cart, you'll notice that it no longer works. So let's look at the console again to see what error we get. We'll right-click, inspect, and open the console, and it's going to tell us that cart is not defined. So the problem that we have here is that in this file, we're using the variable cart. But now, because we're not loading cart.js using a script tag, the cart variable doesn't exist anymore. It's contained inside cart.js, and we can't access it from the outside. So now we're going to learn how to get a variable out of a file or a module. To do that, we're going to do 3 steps. The first step is to add a type equals module attribute. The second step is to export, and the third step is to import. Let's learn these steps one by one. So the first step is to add a type equals module attribute. We're going to open amazon.html, and we're going to scroll to the bottom, and here in the last script tag, where we load amazon.js, we're going to add an HTML attribute here. So we're going to type equals module and save. So the type equals module attribute basically lets this file get variables out of other files. It basically enables this feature. Now the second step is to export. So we're going to go to cart.js, and now we're going to choose which variables can be accessed outside of this file. So for example, we want to access the variable cart outside of this file. To do that, in front of the variable, we're just going to type the word export and space and save. So now this variable can be used outside of cart.js. The last step is to import. So we're going to go to the place where we're going to use this variable, which is inside amazon.js. And now at the top, we're going to tell the computer which variable we want to get from another file. So we'll type import, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and between these brackets, we're going to give the name of the variable we want to get, which is the cart variable. And then we'll tell the computer which file we want to get this variable from. So we'll type from single quotes and semicolon. And now inside these quotes, we're going to locate the file using a file path. So let's open up our files here so it's easy to see what files we have. So right now we're in amazon.js, and we want to locate cart.js. So the first step is we actually need to get out of the scripts folder. We're in the scripts folder, and we need to get out of it and into the data folder. So to get out of the current folder that this file is in, we're going to type ... So ... basically represents the folder outside of this current folder, which is this folder right here, JavaScript Amazon projects. And then we're going to type a / to go outside of the scripts folder. So now that we're outside of this folder, we're going to go into the data folder. So here, we're going to type data and then a slash to go into this folder, and we're going to locate the file cart.js, and save. So what this code does is that it's going to take the variable cart out of the file cart.js, and we use this file path here to locate that file. So as a reminder, ... means to go outside of the current folder, outside of scripts, into here, and then we go into the data folder, and then inside the data folder, we find cart.js. So those are the 3 steps to get a variable out of a module. First, we add a type equals module attribute to enable this feature, and then we export the variables that we want to get out. And finally, we import the variables when we need them. Now there's 2 more things that we need to know about modules. Number 1, we have to put all of our imports at the top of the file. And number 2, in order for modules to work, we need to use live server. So for example, if I open the folder that contains amazon.html, so I open JavaScript Amazon project, and then I select this HTML file and right-click, open with Google Chrome, the website won't work. And that's because modules don't work if we open the HTML file directly like this. So let's close this for now. And to get modules to work, we need to open our code editor and then right-click the HTML file and open with live server. So in this course, in order for modules to work, we need to use live server to open our HTML files. So now that we learned how to use a module, let's talk about the benefits of modules. The first big benefit is that it helps us avoid naming conflicts. The only time that this causes naming conflicts is if we import this variable and we have another variable named cart inside this file, like this. So this will again create a naming conflict. If I save this, the website will stop working. But at least now we have control over when naming conflicts happen. They will only happen if we import the same variable name. Now modules have another feature that allows us to avoid this problem as well. So after the variable name that we import, we can type as and then a different name, such as my cart, and save. So this will basically take the import and rename it to my cart, so that this will no longer conflict with this variable name. So as you can see, modules have a lot of features that help us avoid naming conflicts when we have lots of files in our project. So now I'm just going to delete this and put the code back because that was just an example, and save. So the second big benefit of modules is that we don't have to worry about the order of our files. Before, when we loaded everything with script tags, we had to make sure that we load cart.js first, because we need the cart variable to be created, and then we can use it in amazon.js. So the order of our script tags really matter, and it becomes really hard to manage when we have lots of files in a big project. But now with modules, we can just import the variables that we need, and we don't have to worry about the order that we're loading our files. So as you can see, modules are a better way to organize our code, especially in bigger projects. So now let's use Git and save our changes. So we'll go to the Git section here, and it will tell us we changed 3 files. In amazon.js, we removed the script tag and added type equals module. In cart.js, we exported the cart variable. And in amazon.js, we imported the cart variable from cart.js. So now let's save these into Git. So here we'll type a message, use modules and import cart from cart.js, and commit. Now that we learned modules, let's use them in more places in our project. So let's close this for now. And we're going to open amazon.html. And next, we're going to turn products.js into a module as well. So we'll start off by deleting the script tag, because the script tag will just load all the code onto the page. So we'll delete this and save. So notice that our website stops working. And now inside amazon.js, we need to access products from products.js. So again, we're going to do 3 steps. The first step is to add a type equals module attribute, which we already have, so we don't need to do this again. The second step is to export the variables that we want to get out. So in this case, we want to get the products variable out of the products.js file. So let's open our files and open products.js, and we'll scroll to the top. So to get the products variable out of this file, in front of the variable, we're going to type export and space and save.